So how was she?
Yeah, she was okay. She's not quite 100%. I'm not really happy with what we're feeding her.
She not have enough energy or something?
No, she's got enough energy, but it just, her weight doesn't look quite good enough, and her coat, and I just don't think we've got it quite right.
Well, we're feeding her a lot, and she's in a really good field.
Yeah, I know. I don't really have the answers right now, but I do know where to find them.
Google?
No, not Google. Oi, come on, let's go.
What? Where are we going?
To get the answers.
Where's that?
You'll see.
So here we are, Kentucky Equine Research. This is like the Harvard of equine nutrition.
Yeah, Dr. Joe Pagan is the horse nutrition guru. If he doesn't have the answers on how to feed your horse, nobody does.
And I think he's in here, up at their main barn, and we'll check out their feed room and see what they have to offer. Hi, Joe.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Hi, Dr. Pagan.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
All right, let's get started.
Let's do it.
Great. Welcome to Kentucky.
Thank you.
How was your trip?
Uneventful.
Okay, Joe, we've gotten this new horse in training. Where do I start with it? What do I feed it?
I think the first thing you're going to have to do is figure out what its energy requirement is. So there's a couple of ways you can start there. One is get its history. How much have they been feeding it before? That's going to give you an idea of how much you're going to need to feed it. How much you're going to need is going to be dependent on a couple of things. It's going to depend on its workload, but it's also going to depend on its temperament. So some horses are easy keepers, some are hard keepers. So you're going to have to combine both its temperament and its workload to figure out how much total you need to feed in terms of calories per day.
Hey Joe, that leads on to my question is, what classifies as hard or easy work? I mean, this horse is being ridden 4 or 5 times a week, but what is easy and what is hard?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's pretty subjective now, and a lot of people get it wrong. So trying to figure out exactly what is easy and hard, to a certain degree, you're going to have to use a little bit of a feel for what you think is hard relative to everything else you do. There is some new technology, though, that will allow us to do that. It's our smartphone app, KER Clock It Sport, which is actually going to allow the rider to understand how much they're really working per day or per week.
Okay.
Okay, so if you know the intensity, how does the roughage and forage play into that? I mean, I'm from Texas where there's no grass, but I currently live in Pennsylvania where it's very green. How does that affect what we decide to feed or how we go about that?
Forage is really going to play 2 different roles, and the most important is for gut health. So you need to make sure that you're feeding enough forage. Sort of our rule of thumb is to give 1.5% of the horse's body weight per day. Depending on which forage you pick, it's going to provide different amounts of calories. So once you've decided whether it's coastal or alfalfa, or if you're back with a Timothy hay, from that's going to make a difference about how much additional feed you have to do, but make sure you're feeding enough hay, and again, 1.5% of body weight is a good rule of thumb.
Okay, so I think that for us, we've got a pretty good handle on the grass that we have in Pennsylvania, and we feed a regular hay, so we've got that covered. But when I go to the feed store and I go in the back there, it's kind of overwhelming. There's so many different brands and so many different types of feed. How do I pick an actual type of grain for my horse?
First thing you're going to have to do is figure out how much grain you need to feed. So from the horse's workload, how many calories it's getting from its forage, you decide, I'm going to feed very little grain or I'm going to feed quite a bit.
Okay.
That's step number 1, because that's going to determine which type of feed you make.
Right.
Basically, feed manufacturers are going to have feeds in 2 different forms: a more concentrated form for low intakes and a form that's made for feeding more intake, higher level of intake, And sort of the cutoff is 5 or 6 pounds a day.
Okay.
So that's step one, is you've got to decide, am I in the low intake category or the high intake category?
Right, okay.
Okay, so for example, if I've got an upper level eventing horse that's getting worked 6 times a week, you know, half thoroughbred, half warm blood, how do I kind of decide about that?
Well, I think first that type of horse that's getting exercised that much is going to fall in the high intake category.
Right.
So that's going to narrow the field in terms of what you're going to decide. Then you're going to have to look at that horse and make a decision about what's its temperament. Do I want a feed that has energy sources that provide a little calmer type of demeanor, or is it a horse that needs a lot of energy that I need a higher non-structural carbohydrate intake? So once you decide that, you can start to narrow the specific type of feed that you want to have. The other thing about commercial feeds, and this is a plug for every commercial feed, is they're fully fortified with vitamins and minerals. And so picking the right level, the low intake or the high intake, becomes pretty important because they've been fortified. So if you feed them at that level, you're meeting most of the horse's nutrient requirements for all of the vitamins and minerals. So it's real important that you get that right.
All right, Joe, that kind of leads on to probably a more difficult question, I'm guessing, is what if I've got that average horse at home that I ride just a couple times a week and doesn't really sort of competitive type horse? That sounds like it'd almost be more difficult to figure out what to feed it.
That's really difficult because they've got relatively low energy requirements.
Right.
So the first thing you have to do is to decide how many of the caloric requirements been met just from the forage.
Right.
And in a bunch of cases, the forage has met all of the caloric requirements. So you're not picking a feed to provide additional calories. Then you have to start looking at how am I going to get all those other vitamins and minerals into the horse other than in a feed scoop. So that's why it gets a little tougher. The best thing you can do for that kind of horse, or even the upper level horse though, is learn how to body condition score. And KER has a free body condition score on its website. You can go there and download it. It gives you tips on what the body condition score is on a scale from 1 to 9.
Okay.
Then you can assess the horse, how much fat it has in different parts of the body, and decide, is it just right, is it too fat, or is it too thin? Once you have that, if you've got that easy keeping horse, he's just right or on the fat side, you need to skip the feeds and look at other ways that you get supplementation.
That makes sense. All right, Joe, so I've been hearing a lot about low starch lately, and I was wondering, what do you think about that, as well as what are these different sources specifically that you're talking about?
Well, as I said, one of the things that we're feeding feed for is the source of calories. Traditionally, you'd feed oats, you'd feed corn. Those were high starch sources of calories. One of the big innovations that's occurred with horse nutrition is we've started to replace some of that starch with other energy sources like fat, fermentable fiber. So many horses do better on low starch diets. Some, depends a lot on the individual horse, but in some instances, some will get excitable, they'll be hard to manage, so you can substitute the calories from other sources.
Right.
Again, two of the things you can substitute are fat and fermentable fiber. Fermentable fiber is great. It comes in the form of beet pulp and soy hulls. So a lot of the modern performance feeds have taken down the starch level, gotten those calories from these other two alternative energy sources.
Okay.
Joe, I've decided what feed I want to feed. I've got my forage under control. I'm looking at this bag tag, and it says to feed half a pound to a pound per 100 pounds of body weight, but I feed by scoop. So what do I do with that?
You're not alone. Everyone feeds by scoops, and that's fine. I mean, it's a convenient way, but all feeds are formulated to be fed by the pound. So the thing you've got to do is figure out how many pounds your scoop holds. Then you can do the math easily, decide how many pounds that you're feeding. Again, that's going to be important though for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure, am I feeding the right type of feed? If I'm feeding just a half a cup of something, it's probably not. And also, if you ever want to figure out how many vitamins and minerals and all the rest of the nutrients you're feeding, we can do a nutrition evaluation, but we have to know how many pounds you're feeding.
Okay, Joe, so this kind of looks more like what I'm going to be feeding my competition horse, going back to our earlier examples. Does this look right to you?
Yeah, I think in this particular instance, this scoop of feed weighs 2.5 pounds. If you're feeding 2 or 3 scoops of that, you've picked a feed that's a high intake feed, it's going to be fortified, so you're feeding the right amount. How many times a day you need to feed that's the other decision you need to have. Another one of our rules of thumb, don't feed over 5 pounds in a single feed. So if this weighs 2.5 pounds, don't give them more than 2 scoops in a single feed. Really, the more the better. If you can divide that into 2 or 3 feeds a day, it's better for their digestive health. It's better for their minds as well.
Okay, so if I've got my fat pasture ornament, I'm only feeding him this much. Is this enough, or do they need anything else?
I think if you can fit all of the feed that a horse needs into a cup like this, you're probably looking balancer.
Okay.
This type of feed isn't fortified nearly enough for this level of intake. You need to switch to a balancer that's made to be fed just a cup a day.
Okay, Joe, here it is. Supplements. Please demystify them for me. There's so much on the market now, and you know, for every sort of problem your horse has, there's a supplement for it. What does your horse actually need? If these are complete feeds, do they actually need supplements on top? How does it all work?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is to ask the question, do they need it? What's your goal? When you look at supplements, you can really break them into a couple of categories. Those that are supplying some sort of nutrient that you didn't supply in the forage and the grain, or a supplement for a specific problem or issue that an individual horse has. So for the nutrients that are not in the forage or feed, those are sort of few and far between because these feeds are pretty well fortified and you're covering most of the vitamins and minerals. There are some specific instances like electrolytes, for instance, where the requirement for those is going to be quite a bit different depending on what you're doing with the horse, so that's a time for a supplement. Another supplement is if you just want your horse to look great and have great hooves and coat, then there's supplements specifically for that. That's almost a cosmetic reason. Then you can go into reasons when you have a problem with digestive health or joint health. But the real key here is ask the question, why am I picking a supplement? Then find one that has shown some efficacy for that, that there's some research behind that this actually will help the problem that I've got.
You mentioned electrolytes, Joe, and I know Jimmy and I feed electrolytes to our event horses. How do I figure out how much electrolytes to give, and is there anything I should be looking out for there?
Electrolytes are really important, and the reason they are is horses sweat a lot, and horse sweat is full of electrolytes. It's got a lot more electrolytes than human sweat, so when the horse sweats, it loses a lot of these electrolytes that you have to replace. So you've got to ask 2 questions. One is, what type of electrolyte do I want? And then secondly, how much do I need to feed? The answer to number 1 is pick an electrolyte that's salty. A lot of electrolytes are full of sugar. The horse loves it, but it doesn't have very much electrolyte in it. So look at the label, find one that's got sodium, chloride, and potassium. Those are the electrolytes. Then you feed it at a level that is appropriate for the amount that the horse is sweating. If you've got a horse that you're taking out and it's hot and they're sweating like crazy, sweat's dripping off of them, you need a lot of electrolyte. If they're not sweating that much, just a little damp when they come back, lower levels are appropriate. So you're going to have to change it up and down with the weather and how hard they're working. That's why we can't put them in feeds, is because the energy requirement may stay the same, but the amount of sweating varies. So that's why it's a very appropriate, essential supplement.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, Joe, so you've covered a lot of information, you've answered a lot of our questions. Can I ask you, what would be your top 3 tips when it comes to feeding your horse?
Sure. Number 1, feeding should be simple. It's not that hard. First tip, pick a good forage. Forage is the foundation. Get a good quality forage and make sure you feed enough to ensure gut health. Then pick a feed to top the forage off to meet the horse's energy requirement. Get feedback from the horse with its body condition score. Then finally decide if there's anything missing from the forage and feed, and pick supplements wisely. Pick them when there's a specific reason that you want them. And that's really all there is to feeding horses.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we learned a lot, mate. Thanks for everything.
You bet. Thanks for coming by. Let us know if there's anything else that we can do.
All right.
Good on you, mate. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.